Germaine Greer is well known as the most interesting evangelist of women's liberation, although it is acknowledged in some quarters that what Miss Greer is after is something more than just that. What exactly it is among the purposes of this hour to discover. Her big book is, of course, The Female Eunuch, wherein she angrily and resourcefully makes the point that woman is enthralled to male sexist society, so much so as to become, well, a female eunuch, one of the oxymorons which Miss Greer handles with deftness and abandon. She is Australian, though she lives now in England, teaching literature at the University of Warwick. She received honours always in her academic career at the University of Melbourne, at the University of Sydney, at Cambridge, where she took a doctorate. She exploded on the world scene with her book. She debated with Norman Mailer and polemicized against him and others, seemingly everywhere. She granted interviews everywhere and continues in motion as if everywhere. A few weeks ago, we exchanged a few preliminary observations athwart a dozen young enthusiasts for and against women's liberation movement at Cambridge University here in England. The question then was lightly touched upon: is there a difference between the women's liberation movement and women's liberation? I think I remember that Miss Greer's answer was negative. I should like to begin by asking her, are the two movements or crusades distinguishable?
Well, I don't think there are two crusades. I think the difference is a logical one a priori. There's a difference between the aim and the movement towards it. There's obviously some distinction to be made between the ideal of women's liberation and a movement towards it. But the movements towards liberating women, and I don't think it's necessarily from male sexist society, it's from a much more intricate series of syndromes, not all of which are generated by the male, most of which oppress the male almost, or equally, if not in the same way. When it comes to actually how the ideal is served, it's being served by Catholic women, Republican women, lawyers, mill girls, all kinds of women in all kinds of different ways. Probably the most rhetorical and the most flamboyant are the extreme left-wing movements, which actually concentrate on ideology much more than achievement. The people who actually...
you wish to disavow?
No, I don't. I don't wish to... My problem is I don't wish to disavow any of them, because every movement that anyone has ever heard of for liberation, because it is unauthoritarian, because it attempts to allow a disparity of opinion, falls foul of sectarianism. So I have to do this mental juggling act of reconciling the Professional Women's Association with the radical lesbians, which can be done on certain broad issues, although probably when it comes to things like discipline within the group or personal tactics, I would have a good deal to say in criticism of both. The point is that I'm not about to criticize them to anybody but themselves, or rather to themselves primarily. There is more to be said to explain the movement than to be said by way of carping at what they've done.
Well, but wouldn't you say that even as at a certain point, let's say in the 1920s, or if you're slow about it, in the 1930s, people came to the conclusion that the communist experiment in Russia was primarily marked not by fidelity to Marxist principles, but by the effort of the ins to tyrannize the outs. That at a certain moment, the women's liberation movement can be thought of as more a movement, however we agreed to describe it, than something that simply seeks to give women rights which they have been habitually deprived. And that moment may be just about now, if one is acute on the subject.
I think not. Because from my point of view, the revolution was betrayed in Russia when Lenin decided to ridicule Alexander Kollontai and to absolutely outlaw the workers' opposition. From that moment, it was betrayed. That was in 1919.
Yeah. Now, are we in 1919 in the women's liberation movement?
But we're not in Russia. We don't have any power. We don't have any totalitarian power.
Mutatis mutandis.
Well, I think as long as we don't have an establishment which has powers of purge and imprisonment, we can continue to refine ourselves.
Yeah, but surely excesses don't necessarily involve incarceration. Well, let me ask you your comment on a couple of manifestations, if you like, of the movement. You are aware that there's a very distinguished textbook publisher in America called Scott's, Forsman and Company. Recently, an edict that was issued by the editor of this textbook company in which he accosted the women's liberation movement and set down certain prohibitions. For example, one of them was, writers should take care that a joke about a woman who's a bad driver, a shrewish mother-in-law, financially inept, does not represent these qualities as typical of women as a group. Now, is this a small step forward in the movement that you identify with?
Well, I don't really think that we need to give much credence to textbook publishers who are responsible
for... Why not?
For...
They're very important.
Quite, but they're very important in supplying a certain kind of blinkers. That is such a... I mean, the whole linguistic question of women's liberation is difficult because of the strange paradox of our position, which is the paradox which appears sometimes like a contradiction in my book. Are you to make he and she words equal in estimation, or are you to screen out she as forever incapable of equaling he in estimation, grammatically?
Grammatically?
You could be anti-feminist, you see, by suppressing feminism, by suppressing the femaleness of a pronoun.
But there's no implied hierarchy as far as I can see.
Oh, there is.
Well, now, Scott's form says you should never refer to early man. You should refer to early humans, which means that you can't use the synecdoche.
But not only that, what it means is that the real attitude is going to be concealed by a form of primitive censorship, by a kind of ritual observance, whereas the actual situation won't change. It's like calling people Ms. when in fact they're married. It doesn't change the character of their marriage. And I think it's a sort of hypocrisy.
No, in other words, you think that the emphasis on nomenclature is preposterous?
Well, I think it's such a trivial aspect of a real struggle, and it's been given so much attention. I think it's part of a general movement to co-opt a struggle for existence, really, and turn it into something futile. There are so many questions involved. There is an advertisement on English television. I don't usually get too steamed up about advertisements as sexist. I regard them as universally depraving in their influence. But in this case, the advertisement in question shows a man sitting with three women who are very harshly lit and have sort of greeny yellow frizzy hair, and they are screaming at each other like a bunch of parrots. And it flashes back to his courtship, when this woman next to him was a soft and lovely girl, and then it comes back, and the didascalia, the thing is the motto. I can't think of the English word. I'm thinking in the wrong language. The motto is, some things haven't changed, or some things are still the same. And it's his mug of stout that hasn't changed. His wife has changed for the irrevocably worse. Now, I mean, I can see only one answer to that, which I find amazingly offensive, which is to show a lady of relative handsomeness sitting next to some boozy, blousy, overblown pig of a man, drinking her dry sherry and thinking some things haven't changed. There's no point in making them withdraw the offence. You have to make them understand the nature of the offence, and I'm afraid the only way you can do it is by putting the shoe on the other foot. So perhaps we do have to have her story for a while, even though her story is a remarkably slender volume, because the history of women is unwritten in most ages.
Well, I certainly am under the impression, having watched a lot of advertising, that it's hardly misogynist in character. More often than not, you see, prettier girls on television commercials than you do on London streets. And under the circumstances,
I don't see how that follows.
I can't really see that.
Non sequitur, sir.
Well, no, I can't see that. I can't see that the criticism of the advertising profession is a criticism that sustains that kind of criticism.
Oh well, I'm afraid. I'm sure American advertising is the same. I'm sure it presents people with a very heightened and glossy image of a lifestyle which they don't, in fact, enjoy. I'm sure it has women going into raptures over a chocolate chiffon pie, and it assumes that you can attract a man by knowing how to make gravy out of a brown cube in a packet, and that will make your whole life coherent and sensible.
Well, I think there's a lot of hyperbole in advertising, in political ideology, and in life.
Hyperbole is just a nice way of saying distortion in this case.
Sure.
It sounds prettier, but it's really just the same.
But can't you imagine people saying, at least as convincingly as you have just said, what you have just said, that democratic politics is universally depraving?
Plato said it, didn't he?
Yeah, correct. Oh, well, Plato was not very pro-democratic.
Well, the thing is that when you have
why
ritual
acknowledge
democracy,
such
it's
why
depraving.
speak of such acknowledged madness? Said Alcibiades.
Oh, come.
No, I'm not.
We are flying high today.
My point is very simply this: that you tend to be rather selective in what you categorically denounce.
Naturally, I'd be terrible if I went around categorically denouncing everything.
Well, but I think you do a certain amount of that. Advertising is universally depraving. Is if you advertise and say, be sure to have your chest x-rayed once a year, is that universally depraving?
Well, no, it isn't. I mean, performing a public service, telling people, for example, what civil rights
how do you know
they
what's public
have.
service? Suppose somebody says, drink Coca-Cola, pause, it refreshes, and I then try Coca-Cola and it refreshes me.
Well,
and thenceforth, when I want to be
depends
refreshed,
how
I take a
you feel
Coca-Cola.
about caffeine addiction among the young, really.
Well,
I'd be happier if they took the grain of caffeine out of it. And then it depends how you feel about refined sugar. It depends how you feel about symbolic nourishment, which in fact doesn't nourish at all.
The human system gets along with a certain amount of caffeine without
A certain amount of lead, a certain amount of mercury, all of that. That's true.
That's right. So what I'm trying to say is that, unfortunately...
And dentists are very pleased about the sugar. I'm sure it keeps a lot of dentists alive.
But it sure does. But on the other hand, the dentists formed a lobby that institutionalized the use of that, what do you call that stuff you stick in the water?
Fluoride.
Fluoride, yeah. Now, those were the dentists who were primarily the lobbies for that. See, I'm afraid that the women's liberation movement gets mixed up with a whole lot of sort of
No, it's me. It's me.
neuroses.
I'm not the movement. I'm me. I'm mixed up in all sorts of things.
Yes, but
Universally compromised.
But you are a spokeswoman for the movement.
I'm a writer. I'm a poor, harassed writer.
No, you're not poor. Maybe harassed.
Am I not? I'm a good deal poorer than you. I was
you're
amazed to
getting
read
personal.
that I'm supposed to exploit the hell out of sex. I mean, nobody has made less money out of sex than I have. The average married woman is doing a great deal better out of sex than I
I don't intend to inquire into the subject.
And Hugh Hefner sold 8 million copies of Playboy with an interview with me in it. How much money do I make out of that?
I don't know.
You should know, because people who do that interview in Playboy get nothing.
Having dealt with your agent, I should think quite a lot.
No, it's just done for nothing.
Well, I got $3,000 when I had an interview with Playboy by simply asking for it.
Well, I was told that there just was nothing to be done. I had to sit for a whole week with a very obliging man. The only people who made any money out of it were the peasants who had to dig his Fiat 1600 out of the fields. Well, I mean, somebody's exploiting the hell out of sex. I mean, everybody exploits what they have. That's the nature of the game.
I must find out from Hugh Hefner how he deals with your agent.
Well, he dealt with me, I guess. You should deal with me.
Well,
I might as well say that if you weren't such a good-looking fellow, you wouldn't be in the position that you're in today. You exploit it, too. You may not do it consciously.
Well, now,
Don't
wait a
you
minute.
agree that he's a pretty man?
Let's accept that. Let's accept that as a hypothesis.
I think that interpersonal subjectivity proves it to be true. Just as this studio is pale blue, you're a pretty man, isn't that right?
Now, you see, you're not getting automatic acquiescence.
No, I'm not getting any signs of anything at all. I'm wondering if you haven't given them fluoride.
Their teeth look in pretty good shape. Well, let's see whether you would agree that although we must treat you as an individual, which we're all prepared to do, nevertheless, unless you disavow certain aspects of the women's liberation movement, one can think of you as entitled to speak with some authority about it.
I will not recant. You're quite right. You don't have to.
You will not
bury me.
recant. Okay. Now, some people who are for women's liberation are for also the institution of marriage. Now, you're against the institution of marriage.
I'm against the institution of marriage as it stands, and I don't really see that it can be continued in its present form because its roots are inextricably bound in a good deal of complicated canon law and property law, which very few people know their way around even now. I think that there is probably a future for monogamy, and it probably would have to be sanctified or made important by some external sign. But I guess I'm pretty much like the 16th century reformers who were actually passionately for marriage, who wanted it to be rescued from the limbo of sacramental signs and made an ordinary contract between people operating in full understanding of the consequences.
Well, I think that your refinements are extremely interesting. I'm, at this juncture, however, more interested in whether one can identify your position on marriage as a part of the women's liberation movement. You did tell Hugh Hefner, for nothing, you volunteered the statement that marriage is, quotes, the worst possible system for raising children. And then you went on to say to the questioner who asked whether you believed that families should be close-knit, who asked you, did you consider that a disadvantage? You replied, unquestionably.
Well, you see, the thing I'm talking about is the 20th century phenomenon of the couple.
Yeah.
And I think close-knitting people within such a small group is very damaging. You see, if you think about it in another way, the generation gap arises out of having polarized households, the parents and the rest, or the kids and the oldies, or whatever angle you're looking at it from. But when you have a larger family that is knit, but not so closely knit, you also have people of all the intervening age groups. You don't have this chasm of 20 or 30 years over which the generations glare at each other, refusing to translate their basic concepts into some continuous language. I think that the whole generation gap is, and I believe it exists. I have no doubt that it exists as a university teacher. I mean, I have kids on my hands all the time with problems, and the one place none of them look like going to is home. They go everywhere else but home. The home is the place where there'll be least resonance, there'll be least understanding of the situation they've got themselves into. And this is observed over, 12 years now. So, there's something wrong in these families. They may appear to be close-knit, but they're so tightly knit that they're rupturing themselves, and the relationships are becoming painful. I would like to see the family restructured away from this little vestigial limb of the nuclear family, of the couple with all their miseries and their carefully spaced children, or their no children, or their 1.3 or whatever is the norm. I think it's about 2.1.
1.3 would not be the norm.
I think it is in Sweden.
I mean for an individual couple.
Oh, well, of the norm. I mean, the individual couple is never normal. I mean, it's always abnormal. It's either got too few or too many children or none at all. And it's trying to follow a lifestyle which is full of contradictions, which is breaking people's hearts. I mean, they just can't manage. And I think that if you really care about people, you have to think of a way of life that is more supportive. You have to think of a kind of family where a little child who's got into some fix with his mother where he just can't talk or just can't manage to bridge some sort of a gap or some kind of hostility, has actually someone to go to, someone to intervene, someone else to explain to. You still see it in this country in West Indian families, for example, which still keep their sibling relationships even after they've married into other families, where the children are allowed to move quite freely from household to household. They try to stay in one area. But the mobility of labor and this sort of executive syndrome, which means that if the boss says it, you pull up the stakes and you move across the country somewhere, means that the children are forever at risk. They never manage to get themselves, well, they sometimes manage to get themselves a context where they're at liberty, where they can move and roam, and where their parents don't feel that everything that happens is their fault. I think the blackmail of parents in our own age is terrible.
Well, I think that your experiences, at least I hope your experiences have been unique.
Unique, folks?
Simply to remark that there are misunderstandings between parents and children, and to remark that the perpetual travel can be deracinating.
I don't know about what the statistics are, but it is very high, isn't it? The statistics of people who have lived in 2 or 3 places in the course of the growing up of their children in the United States are terrifying. I don't remember what they are.
But there's... let me ask the question, why is it terrifying? Here a moment ago we had what seemed to be a perfectly well-adjusted young man who had been to school in Holland, in England, in Germany, and in America, and he didn't look odd.
Some of my best friends are diplomats' children. They have their problems.
Well, everybody has problems. But
I happen to think that these are serious problems that are giving rise to a peculiar kind of inability in our society to cope with anything.
Well,
including things like
all
divorce
problems are serious.
and rupture and hostility.
All problems are serious, but
no,
how does that relate to the women's liberation movement? What is the unique, what is the nexus between what you have just described and deplored and the women's liberation movement?
Because the family hinges upon, and all its conflicts come home to the woman, who is supposed to be there, who's supposed to be the linchpin, who's responsible for the bringing up, almost totally responsible, which I think is another distortion of the right situation.
And you would have it how? You would relieve the mother of what? Or of which of her responsibilities as regards the
Whichever
child?
one she wished to be relieved of, by sharing them among a greater number of people. You see, I don't think that child rearing is an inferior occupation.
I don't doubt that.
I think it is a degraded occupation in our society because it's been turned into a duty. I think that cooking meals for people is a great thing to do. It's something I personally love to do.
Yeah.
But turning it into one person's sole responsibility 3 times a day for the term of her wedded life takes the joy out of it and makes it a compulsion. I don't think anybody, I mean, I'm a bit naive and D.H. Laurentian about this, but I don't believe that anybody should have to do the same thing all the time. Well, I sometimes sound as silly as he, is what I meant. I don't think anybody should be defined by what they do. I don't think you should be able to say to somebody, "What are you?" and he answers, "A sanitary engineer."
No, but all you're asking for is intelligence.
Oh,
And
well,
I
that's the
don't
most
see-
impossible thing to get.
I don't see, well, I know, and I don't mind you asking for the impossible, but you seem to give this an ideological a framework that is rather distressing. People who are in favor of women's liberation and who certainly do not believe that a wife ought to be chained to the kitchen stove, nevertheless feel that it's sort of a normal allocation of responsibility if the wife undertakes to see, by however means, that food will appear 3 times a day. Even as the husband accepts certain collateral responsibility.
The reason why it becomes an ideological matter is that when I look at the way that the whole system is organized, I can only see a way out, and that very dimly, and not in at all a dogmatic way, but I can only see a way out through a change in the nature of our institutions and our understanding of work and desert and whatnot into something much more cooperative and much more varied, much less streamlined and authoritarian. The irony is that women are now beginning to demand the right to have their work recognized as productive, whether it be of children or of hosiery or whatever.
I'm all in favor of that.
But they're
and that's what
doing
I call
that.
women's liberation as distinguished from women's liberation movements.
Well, I don't think
For instance, I think that the GNP certainly ought to comprehend the pie that is baked by a woman. Why not?
Well, it does include prostitutes' earnings in France, but not here.
Well, that's professional.
Well, it depends. I suppose gambling earnings
Well,
can be
by definition,
professional.
prostitute is, as distinguished from other kinds of activity.
But you see, the problem seems to me that women now are beginning to demand the right of productive work, just when the opportunities for productive work are gradually withdrawing.
Productive work? I thought we agreed that it was productive to cook.
But the whole point is that women still have the concept of a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. That's the concept that has to change. We have as much of a struggle against the trade union movement with its entrenched systems of bargaining and corruption and everything else, as we do with other things, with bosses and with the people who already are trying to find the ways out of the equal pay legislation. I can't see any solution but a radical one. It's a Gordian knot that has to be cut somehow. And this is where you get into the frightening postulate of chaos as a prerequisite for building a kind of order which would be more comprehensive.
Well, of course, it doesn't follow that chaos leads to order. Chaos can often lead to more chaos.
Well, I think when you have partial authoritarian systems, you get more chaos without people being aware of its real nature. I mean, what I'm driving up to is a theory of something like a revolution. Now, I don't mean by revolution fighting in the streets. That's not revolution, that's normality. That's today and every day. That's chaos under the system.
Well, systematic fighting in the streets.
No, not even that, because civil war, I mean, Vietnam is a case in point. I mean, Vietnam is wounded mortally. I don't know what can possibly arise from that situation.
You don't know what?
I don't know what can arise from the ashes of that country. It's really hopelessly laid waste, as far as I know. I didn't spend very much time there, but it seemed to me to be leprous in a terrible moral way.
Well, something arose from Germany post-Hitler, right?
Well, I don't know whether anything ever really got destroyed there. I mean, when I got off the plane in Düsseldorf...
A lot of people.
Well, but they don't matter, you see.
Don't they?
Well, they don't matter to the people who destroy them.
A lot of cities.
Either in Vietnam
a lot of industry.
Dresden.
A lot of ports, museums.
But the point I'm about to make is, when you get off the plane in Düsseldorf, you know what you see. You see on one side, Krupp, in enormously high blue letters, and on the other side, Thyssen, in enormously high yellow letters. So you say, plus ça change. What did they die for? People have always died.
Well, I don't think one should necessarily be against Krupp any more than one should be against Vickers.
It depends if they think really waged the war.
We like them to make war machines at a moment when we desire war.
Well, don't include me in the royal we in this case.
Well, I take it you were in favor of the defense of England during the war, but or is that against the women's liberation movement?
I think I'm always in favor. I mean, I've got a pile of vitriolic letters on my desk at the moment because I was asked if I'd join the army. Women are about to be drafted, it would appear, in that man's army.
What man's?
Mr. Nixon's army.
Are they really?
Apparently.
They just stopped drafting men. Why would they start drafting women?
Oh, draft is probably the wrong word. I probably should have said recruit.
You mean they've been accepting volunteers
well,
since
I don't know what they're going to do. They'll probably do what they've always done. Well, no, it was put to me by Dick Cavett. No, I don't rely on Dick Cavett any more than you do.
He's probably making a joke.
No, I think he meant to be saying something. I mean, it's hard to tell with Dick Cavett, but I think he was
And what
serious.
did you say that got you the vitriolic...
Well, I said that you see, the war in Vietnam has been fought against women. 2/3 of the posters that were put out in Da Nang to pick up guerrillas by were posters of 12-year-old girls. And all the wars in future, as Orwell pointed out, will be made on civilian populations, which means that women will be at war, whether they like it or not. And I would be at war in that situation. If you regard England as a resistance movement or a national liberation front, I guess I'd be in favor of the defense of England at that time. I also said that I understood and probably would do the same in similar circumstances as the woman who used to ride around in Saigon on a motorbike shooting GIs in the back. And everybody got terribly cross, as if Vietnam was the OK corral and I'd broken the rules. They don't seem to understand that armies of resistance have always shot people in the back. They can't take the chance of asking them to turn around.
Oh, no, I think that what you make is a perfectly safe historical generality, that people are going to resist. And the real question is, should you hang them, of course. You hang Lord Haw Haw, and I think the case for hanging him was a substantial one. But surely the vitriolic letters...
You sound very much now like an extremist in the women's liberation movement, who want the death penalty for rape. I don't want the death penalty for anything.
Well, you consider rape a, quote, not very serious offense, unquote.
It's universal. I don't see how it can be made a serious offense. It's only ever treated as a serious offense.
Is it also universally depraving?
When the committer is quite incapable of defending himself. In other words, when he's obviously at a loss, like poor or black or ignorant or inarticulate or something of that sort.
Well, now that's an interesting point. I happen to know that your position is against prisons of any sort. And sometimes, if I'm saying so, I suspect that you are fetched by these positions because they're kind of provocative, rather than because... But you say, after all, prisons don't rehabilitate and so on and so forth. I think you're quite right, they don't. But they do sequester. And I think a case can be made for sequestering a rapist.
Well, what you have to say is they don't sequester them long enough, then.
Oh, well, maybe not, maybe not.
Perhaps everybody who goes to jail should go for life.
Well,
Perhaps there should be a big pit underground with a grill on the top. You just drop them in there.
Certainly people who go on and murder the second time, I think it would have been better if they had been in jail than if they had murdered again. But prisons do at least accomplish that. Is it part of the women's liberation movement that rape ought not to be considered an offense?
Well,
or just not a grievous offense?
I just went in print at great length pointing out that perhaps more damaging than violent rape, which is a bit like being knocked down by a runaway truck or something, it's traumatic, all right, but it's not something you're tempted to internalize. It's just like being struck by lightning or something. But women get raped in petty ways by people who are close to them, which is much more sinister.
You're not going to use the
because
metaphor
they
now,
internalize it. No, I mean that a woman who is being badgered into sexual submission, or blackmailed, or wheedled, or overcome, or argued out of it, a woman whose will is overridden, who...
Raped by entrapment.
Whose no is not regarded as a serious denial, and then is treated like a slut, and which is what usually happens, who doesn't get called again and realize that was another time when she got ripped off. She internalizes that and begins to wonder if she's a slag or promiscuous or just doesn't make it, is, one of those girls who's never going to get a 85-carat diamond. And that's much more dangerous. And it's a moral thing, much more. I mean, I was arguing that people would take no for an answer even when they suspected that women didn't mean it. Let them find out.
No, I think you're absolutely right if what you're saying, that sins of the spirit are really worse than corporal sins. But on the other hand, only a certain category of sins lend themselves to state retribution, if you like. And the fact that there are dirty old men who will seduce nice young girls, and the dirty young men.
They're
I use dirty old men
foolish, self-involved young men.
Is not something that we need to condone in order to take the position that, however, they ought not be put in jail.
There's no way. I mean, that's my point. The point about the rapist who attacks an unknown woman in the street is that he can usually be identified, if he's given follow-through care, as suffering from some particular syndrome. And there's very little work of this kind being done, but it's turning out to be very rewarding. There's another kind of rapist who's committing a crime against property and who uses the woman as property. And there's a joke current among the police that a burglar who commits a violent break-in might as well rape the woman because that's one crime he can have on the books, because he won't be brought to book for it.
Why?
He'll only be brought to book for assault, because there's probably not a corroborative witness.
Is that a peculiarity of local law?
It's a peculiarity of rape law, including the United States. Corroborative evidence is required in the United States.
It's a difficulty of evidence more than a difficulty of law. Obviously, you've got to prove it.
You can prove assault more easily. You don't need corroborative evidence for that. You just need the evidence of an assault having occurred and the man being present at the time. But for rape, you need corroborative evidence of penetration. Well, that's not so easy to get. You've got to, apart from the fact that many rapists are sexually incompetent and don't ejaculate, some of the laws of evidence require semen in situ, which can be accepted or disregarded. A lot is left to the judge's discretion.
Not in England, I may add.
Not in England ever.
No, the point in England
is that
it's an issue for the jury, and by and large, if you have a burglary with intent to commit rape and you have somebody who says she's being raped, by and large, one expects the jury to believe it.
Yes, but if it's a burglary which is just to steal, when the rape is a kind of an afterthought, there's a lot of, apparently it's a pattern that the police are beginning to recognize in the States, but it's such a long and complicated legal story. It's the least reported crime on the books. It's the least successful, even when prosecuted, to arrive at a conviction. I think the percentage in the States is 17%.
Surely, Miss Greer, this has largely to do with the fact that victims of rape are not universally anxious to come forward and give testimony of a kind that can be rather ignominious.
They'd be discouraged by most lawyers from doing so because the evidence about character is permissible. So anything can be said, providing the people who say it come from the actual vicinity where she lives. In America, it actually has a bylaw in some places that evidence from people living in another town will not be accepted. But if her neighbors say that she's a woman of loose habits and flirtatious dress, well, that's it. They'll plead provocation, enticement, or whatever the word is.
Yeah, in factual questions, it is up to the jury, of course, to decide. But I understand you to be saying sort of paradoxical things. On the one hand,
I always say paradoxical things.
Yeah, which is very interesting. But you don't mind my saying that you always say paradoxical things?
No, I mean, it seems to me that rape is either a psychotic crime or whatever the correct word would be, a crime of someone who is disturbed.
Yeah.
In which case there is a special attitude to take to that, or else it's a crime against property, which wouldn't occur if women were treated less as chattels and more like people. You're actually committing a crime against the menfolk. On the books, you commit a crime against the father or the husband of a woman when you rape her.
Well, in America, the penalties against rape are extremely high.
Which is another reason why anybody who's charged with rape fights to the death.
Sure. Well, it's true of murder also, but I don't quite understand you because I see you saying two things. Number one, that rape is not all that serious an offense. And number two, that the prosecution of rapists is undercultivated
in a male society.
It's undercultivated.
And yet you say
in terms
the
of
offense
law.
is primarily against the male.
But I'm speaking from the point of view of the law. I'm not saying that I think it ought to be more prosecuted. I'm simply pointing out from a policeman's point of view, a rape case is a dreadful headache, and it's something you would much rather not be involved in, because it'll be months of work, it'll be an incredible schmozzle in the court, it'll be full of heart-rending scenes, and it probably won't end in a conviction. It's just a drag. It's a bore having this schizophrenia in the law. On the one hand, violent rape is regarded as a crime second in degree only to murder.
Yeah.
And petty rape, which is practiced on helpless women who don't even know how to verbalize what's being done to them, is regarded as perfectly normal procedure. This is another example of hypocrisy. Now, I understand that laws have got to involve themselves with absolutes, that laws have got to be particularly myopic about what I call the creative dimension of moral decisions. They cannot accept all cases in terms of all the operant factors. They have to make certain statements like, it is impossible for a juvenile to consent. Sexual intercourse upon a juvenile, however defined by the law, and the ages vary, is always rape. That's how the law has to operate. You and I both know that it isn't always rape.
Like you can vote at 18 on the assumption that you are politically mature at 18.
Or something's happened to you at 18.
Yeah.
I mean, they become ritual and unconscious things,
But
and rape is rather too ritual and unconscious. Rape law, I mean.
Once again, though, is this really a part of the women's liberation movement? If you were here to say, look, what really outrages men about rape is not the offense committed on the woman, but the offense indirectly committed on the man, forcible cuckolding, if you like. And that under the circumstances, high penalties against rape are really narcissistic and male-serving, then I would say you have a very interesting point. But you're not really saying that either. And therefore, I don't understand why your observations are related to the women's liberation movement.
Well, I'll tell you why they're related to the women's liberation movement. First of all, the law of rape doesn't serve women. It doesn't help a raped woman at all. It makes her life 20 times more miserable. The second she goes into the precinct...
Punishment helps. Punishment sometimes is a considerable psychic relief.
But
if you know that
she
somebody's
is punished for months before there's any chance of the man being punished. She is punished by having to make statements, having to repeat herself, having to relive a traumatic experience, which any psychologist would tell you it is better for her health that she forget as soon as possible, that she concentrate on forgetting it, which is another reason why women don't prosecute very often. She's got to relive that experience. She's also got to justify herself to the policeman when she first goes into the precinct. Now, the point is this, that prejudice against women is so strong.
Where?
Throughout our society. It doesn't always express itself in very overt terms. But the woman who goes in to make a rape complaint is starting off miles behind the 8 ball. She has got to prove to those people that she's not trying to blackmail somebody, that she's not hysterical, and so on, for hours. I mean, I've known women who were questioned where they're still torn around and bleeding and so on. They've been questioned for 7 hours
but
after
surely
the rape.
Surely you don't believe that a defendant in a rape charge hasn't got the right to interrogate the victim if what is in prospect for him is 30 years in jail.
Quite. That's why I think the whole thing is unworkable.
Well, then, look.
I'm not interested in punishment. Let's get that straight.
If a mother sees a child killed by a robber, a psychiatrist will no doubt say the mother ought not to dwell on the episode at all. Yet, in point of fact, that mother will be called to give witness against that robber when he's apprehended.
She won't be questioned in anything like the same way or required to give the same kind of evidence as the woman. Now, look, the point is this. I'm not interested in the punishment of rapists. I'm interested that the raping should stop. My desire is quite simple. If it will stop a certain number of rapes by dealing intelligently with psychotic rapists, then do that. If it will stop raping, but if women are taught to defend themselves, and if a man will not attack them with impunity because he knows that they have some control over their bodies, that they can take a defensive posture. Most women have no idea how to defend themselves. And it's not a matter of strength, as any commander will tell you. It's a matter of knowing what to do.
Yeah, well,
but they just don't know what to do. On the other hand, what I am concerned to do as well for women who are raped is I'm not interested in the rapist. The rapist has so far got all the attention. I'm interested in the woman, and what I would like to see is the same thing that they have in the States, in some places, not enough, rape crisis centers which are run by women who care about other women. That's what the women's liberation movement is all about. So when they get a woman who comes to them and says, I've been raped, they don't say, prove it. They say, well, you know, tell us about where does it hurt, what do you want, who are you afraid to tell, do you want a doctor, do you want an abortion, do you want tranquilizers, do you want, what do you want? You know?
Okay, I agree with you. I agree with you. If
Let's
that's
have that.
part of the women's liberation movement, I'm for it.
So
Why do you want a
women's health
communist
centers.
state?
Why do I want? Well, now I understand that you make no distinction. I've heard you say between communism and fascism, which would indicate that the word communist doesn't mean the same to you as it does to me.
Well,
Now, when
I don't make distinctions where they're the same.
Ah, well, if you mean state capitalism, as in Russia, I mean, I don't make too many distinctions between that and monopoly
State power,
capitalism.
single-party
except
state,
they're poor.
single-party state, the supremacy of the state concern over that of the individual. So.
Yeah, well, yeah, we'd agree on that point, but I understand communism to be a situation in which the means of production are in the hands of the people.
Oh, but you've penetrated that superstition, haven't you?
Well, it doesn't exist, I know that.
I mean, the notion that you should own own one share each in the state, and that this liberates us is one of those one of those superstitions from which
But that's not
people
my notion
grow
at
up.
all. You see, for example, to go back to what I was trying to say before, and I got sidetracked somewhere, that women are now struggling for the right to productive work, when the actual amount of work that needs to be done in order to sustain the community is diminishing because of sophisticated procedures. Now, what is happening is that instead of more people having more leisure and living at a higher standard, more people are out of work altogether, is the way things are going at the
Then
moment.
when?
In England, well, we've only
the
got 750,000 now.
Oh,
From the
really? Do you have more
Depression.
unemployment
We
than
have more
1930s?
unemployment
No,
than
it's
we did in
the-
the
Why don't you
90s.
do something about
It's
it?
the highest unemployment
Why
since
don't we
the-
do something about it? We didn't elect the Tories.
You've had a socialist government for most of the last 25 years.
No, the
And
unemployment...
Keynes eliminated the problem of unemployment, all kinds of things.
No, what's
why are
happened
you
in
so
fact, Bill,
backward?
what's happened in fact, Bill, is that
We don't
unemployment...
govern the country, us.
No, the unemployment is now the highest it's been for 30 years. It was
that's
over 1 million
after
about a year ago. And this has only occurred in the last 3 or 4 years, actually.
30 from 1973 makes
It's
1943.
1930s. It's 1930s figures.
Yes.
It's not 1940s.
No,
it's
beginning of the 40s.
1930s.
Sorry, it's 30 years. It's 30 years plus since we had unemployment at the level we have it now.
Well, in our capitalist society, we have much less unemployment than we had during the 30s.
You've still got a much higher level incident than we have.
8%.
Yes,
something.
yes, it's true, but it's also true that we throw into the unemployment figure a whole lot of people who would not have been thrown in under more conventional accounting.
Well, we don't throw
And-
them
and of
in.
course
In
you have a
fact,
much
we
higher proportion of black.
underestimate our unemployment.
Yes. We see
Because
women. This is
women
interesting-
never register as unemployed.
Yes, one of the very interesting things on this.
Maybe
someone-
there's too much taxation, and therefore, under circumstances, there's not much a vigorous enough.
It's much more sinister
employment.
than that.
No, it's much more than that. That when women, are made unemployed when there's a trade recession, as Helene says, they don't register as unemployed. So we don't know how much unemployment there is. In fact,
Well,
there's
they
probably well over 1 million here. Very large percentage.
And they're going to be more. I mean, because it's largely down. I think it's largely down to what I was saying. I don't think the English economy, which was carefully dismantled by the Americans, I don't think this economy can compete with Western Germany, which was carefully built up by the Americans. We have an irrational industrial system which is breaking down. And I don't see any amount of grinding the withers of the poor, which is what the only solution this government can find.
Well,
it's not going to
rubbish, Miss
work.
Greer.
Would you deny that that the lowest paid worker is footing the bill for the present slight rise
Oh, that's
in
absolutely
productivity
nonsense.
in
We've
this
increased
country?
welfare more than any other government ever has done before. Unemployment is high, but there's a high proportion of people who are frankly incapable of being employed in a modern economy in it. The situation is largely created by Mr. Roy Jenkins' excessively deflationary budget. And to
all those wicked civil servants,
To
isn't it?
suggest, for instance, that this government is grinding the face of the poor is just a damnable lie. And what's more, a piece of sanctimonious hypocrisy.
Watch your
But still.
Maybe I'm not at all perturbed by being told that I've uttered a damnable lie.
No,
The
it's a
unfortunate thing is
it's a
people in
political
America
crime.
won't have very much idea of whether I have or not.
No.
The English will make up their own minds about that.
Yes.
Well, I think we can leave aside
You,
causation. of it, shouldn't we?
you think the Americans will be more servile in accepting Mr. Evans' characterization of you than the English?
He didn't characterize me. He
No,
characterized what I
What
said.
you
But you
said,
see,
yeah.
the English poor don't have a chance of judging the record of this Conservative government from this show. The Americans may take what Roger says. The people who are living in the economic situation in Britain in 1973 know exactly who is paying for our slightly improved rate of growth.
That's why there was no unemployment under Wilson.
We may have increased
Of course
welfare,
there's
but we've also
unemployment
increased
under Harold Wilson,
prices.
Bill. Don't kid me along.
But why don't
But,
we
you know,
ask...
Harold Wilson
not as
wasn't
much.
running a socialist government, and I think it's a mistake you keep making to think
Yeah.
that Harold Wilson was running a socialist
Yes, I
government.
don't think you
Well,
can
there's no
call it
unemployment in Russia.
socialist.
It's quite right.
Welfare
Harold Wilson
statism
claimed
is not the
before.
same thing as socialism.
I think the causation is, in a sense, irrelevant to what's actually happening
Yes.
at present. You know, we can all argue about causes, and we can all write... you
Sure.
know, brilliant.
Professor Galbraith is just back from, from China. I just read his book, and he says rather wistfully that there isn't this unemployment in the cities because people aren't allowed to go to the cities. That's one way of handling it. And he's obviously speaks rather nostalgically for the time when he was setting prices. But why don't you ask Ms. Greer questions about the women's liberation
Sure.
movement, if you will?
Yes, certainly. We'll, you know, one of those rare moments
We're
getting
not
back
allowed
onto
to
the
talk
subject.
about the poor, we're only allowed to talk about women.
Well, no, I think this is
The
strange.
women are a lot of the poor instead.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the question I wanted to ask, which in a sense worries me about the women's liberation movement, and I'm distinguishing it from your position, is that by stressing women, they forget the rest of the population by saying, all right, women ought to have a more powerful
Well, Ms.
voice.
Greer doesn't
Well,
forget.
no, I know, but the women's liberation movement, by stressing women, ignores the more general political aims. That you yourself have said, you know, you want a socialist society, or perhaps use that as the fairest word. Some of your people in the women's liberation movement seem to want a female society and confuse the two aims.
Well, there's so much going on, so many reforms being pressed at various points on the scale, and all in such an inauspicious context, that one simply has to understand each one on its merits. For example, I am not terribly concerned, it's not one of my primary concerns, that there are not women on the boards of major industry, or that there are not women Tory members. I couldn't really give a twirl, but I can quite see that these are symbolic struggles, and that when you change the face of that situation, you have a change in attitude. And the change we have to make is so radical that I will welcome any alteration in the current assumptions. For example, I'm not terribly anxious to see factory owners running creches for children.
Running what?
Running creches, daycare centres for children, because I think that the state gets to our children quite early enough, and I can't really understand. I can see that the atmosphere could be really repellent. It could be authoritarian, with the children having to call somebody miss. They could be made to put their head on the table and sleep from 2 till 3 because that's what the timetable said. I can see it all being a disaster, but I can also see that we've got to go through it, because the women who are doing 2 jobs at once, who are dashing between doing the shopping and getting meals, and the women you see running out of factory gates while the men stroll to the pub, those women need help, and I don't care which way it comes to them. And the other thing is, when they get a bit of help, they'll then have a little leisure to take a longer view. In other words, to become political and not simply governed by expedience.
Is this one of the great problems that you're highlighting with taking on the work ethic as it is at the moment, as a woman, and just saying, I want the right to go out to work the same as my husband does and do as boring, grinding and badly paid a job as he does in the same sort of factory, and have somewhere that I can leave my kids during the day rather than have to stay at home and do a grinding, boring and even less well-paid job and look after the kids at the same time.
It's turning out
You
that
see,
it's an unpaid
but
job.
what worries me about the symbolism of the women's liberation movement is that it also can lead to tokenism, and it also can lead to scapegoating, to women seeing men as the villains
Absolutely.
rather than seeing the economic system as the villains. And that's why, you know, you described before the women's liberation movement as women caring about other women, and that was what it was all about. But I think that to achieve women's liberation, the only way you achieve it is through a socialist revolution rather than a women's
I would agree with you. That's why I lay
And
such
that's what-
stress on
yeah.
Kollontai.
Yeah.
It strikes me as absolutely symptomatic that the workers' opposition and the women's movement in Russia perished on the same day, because they're the same thing.
But you see, I worry that the authority structure can set one side against another. You
It
know, the
will
Northern
do.
Ireland situation is a classic
It absolutely
one,
will do.
that it will set women against workers.
Well,
you know,
I had the
and
situation in
that
Washington.
women's liberation, by organising as a feminist movement, is compromising, and by organising on those means will never achieve its aims.
Well, the problem is this. I mean, I had a symbolic confrontation in Washington that was exactly what you're talking about, where we found that the Pentagon defended against a couple of hundred women who just meant to go and shout away a pleasant afternoon while Nixon was at Cape Knit or wherever he goes for his holidays. And there we all were, you know, sort of emoting away like mad, and the Pentagon was being defended by a line of about 100 black policemen. And I thought, oh, this is marvellous. I mean, they'd really like us to fight to the death here on the steps of the Pentagon. And I was so completely freaked out by it, I just went almost crazy. I agree with you absolutely, but women have always been in the socialist movement. They have always worked their guts out of the socialist movement. They have got absolutely nowhere. They've always been tyrannised over by unstable leftist males who needed more ego maintenance than most men do.
Which, of course, the irony there, of course, is that women tend to support right-wing parties more than men do, which shows the amount of liberation is necessary.
But oppressed people generally do, I think, because they're terrified of change, because change can only be for the worse.
No, I was really emphasising the amount you have to do, rather than saying, you know, it's
Sure. I realise that the Tory Women's Conference is about the most significant group of women in the country.
Yes, it is. But the difficulty, Miss Greer, is this. Let's take your view. Say, for instance, you paid women for doing whatever job they do, going out to work, or paid for doing domestic chores, whatever it might be. And this does link up again with the unemployment question. You could alter the situation by doing that, and instead of doing what you want to do, to create a totally different hierarchy in the social system. Certain jobs are very unpleasant. If you increased wage differentials to a much, much higher extent, then a professional couple, a professional man and a professional woman, could both afford to hire servants to do their routine domestic chores. And one of the difficulties, you see, with the sort of neither socialist, perhaps in your sense, state that we've got in this country, is the fact that we've made labour so expensive. We've reduced wage differentials to the extent that professional couples in this country, for instance, find it terribly difficult out of earnings to hire servants to run their homes. And indeed, if you're going to give everyone an equal stake in the economic system, you might argue that, for instance, there's no reason at all why we've got all these unemployed, but an awful lot of them are unemployed because basically they do not want to do domestic jobs, which in fact it's very much in the interests of society that they should do.
Well, the point is this, you see, and it seems to me a fairly obvious one. If you think of a tower block of flats at 6 o'clock in the evening, there is the most staggering duplication of labour, most unnecessary duplication of labour going on there, because the families have been divided into these small, not incestuous is the wrong word, but antisocial, self-defensive units. Now, that's why I talked about the solution being radical. You could do all the things you're speaking. You could have a race of helots. But I am naive enough to suppose that we will only ever have anything like equality because we shall have non-human helots. We'll have machines to do the work.
But the whole point is that machine-made goods are now cheaper relatively, so therefore the importance of labour is very much greater in the economy. We can buy a car that's cheaply, but the thing we can't do is pay for a servant. You see, for instance, I would be quite happy not to have a wife, I don't in fact have one, not to have a wife to look after me at home, if, for instance, I could afford out of my professional earnings to go and eat in the Savoy each evening. I'm quite prepared to do that.
You could eat in the greasy spoon, lots of people do.
That's unpleasant.
I don't have any servants. I tend to eat in the greasy spoon. Yes, life is like that.
But if you increase, for instance, differentials, and indeed pay women for going out to work or for staying at home, you could create a situation whereby everyone was treated economically, and you could run things much more efficiently.
You're seeing everything in such bloody financial terms, you know, that if you pay women for doing a degraded job, not degrading.
Like a man.
What's degrading about it?
Degraded.
What's degraded about it?
It's
Because
underestimated.
it's thought to be the only resort of the non-intelligent woman, the only thing that the woman is capable of.
That's the same for a man.
To be yes, exactly. Now I'm
Most
trying to
work
say
has no
that
dignity
work
in
in the
us.
house.
Exactly, I agree.
I'm
But
trying
it's
to say
necessary.
that work in the home, domestic work, is worthwhile, enjoyable, can be creative, but has to be shared. It has not to be seen as something that the woman does because it is her duty to do it and for no other reason. Now, I think you're never going to get servants to do that sort of work. I mean, who looks after the servants' kids, for Christ's sake? Who looks after the servants' by money? Now, I'll take a very
It's a question
simple...
of organisation. It's not just a question of reward. You don't just have to print more money.
A simplistic example is the kibbutz system in Israel, you know, and one would say that it had been in many ways debased itself. But there you would see the man who was the big boss of the kibbutz, the elected head of the council that did all the buying, doing his weekly turn of cleaning out the lavatories.
But that's
Well, because
just
he elects
economically
to.
inefficient.
No.
There's nothing wrong with his doing anything he elects to do. As a matter of fact, 27% of the people in the kibbutzes now are hired, as you know.
Yes, I know.
And as a percentage
that's why I said
of
degraded.
Yeah,
system.
well, presumably Israel has opted not to require people to live in kibbutzes. And it seems to me this is the most civilized decision on the part of Israel, that people who want to live in the kibbutz are people, or should be people who volunteer to do so.
I'm just giving an accolade to the voluntary system.
No, but it's a key, I think, to an understanding of the women's liberation movement insofar as it is a revolutionary doctrine. We are simply rehearsing the same kind of thing that Beatrice Webb was talking about tiresomely 50 years ago.
The problems are
No, you're
real.
not tiresome.
No, but the problems are real. They have not been
The notion
solved.
that it is
done something about
degrading
it.
to look after the trash.
No, look, you have misunderstood. Our argument is not that it's degrading to do anything at all, but that it is unfair to define whole classes of people like Harijans by the fact that they do it.
No, we don't object to specialisation of labour. We're purely concerned with the dignity of the individuals who do it.
Oh, we must have a different.
But who
wants to sweep our
perhaps the
lavatories?
English society says that only females
No, but we agree that the
may
jobs are
empty the
unpleasant.
garbage cans, but
That's another question.
certainly not American society. American society does not distinguish between the sexes
No, we're not
when it
saying
comes to
that.
doing work that's unpleasant. Or
No,
menial.
I think we've broadened it in the sense that we're saying that whoever does the job should be treated the same dignity as someone who does another job.
Of course it
For
does.
other reasons, there may be differential rewards, although I think two people here would like to narrow the rewards. But we're saying that someone who should do the job should be treated with reasonable dignity. This is the
Shouldn't
point.
they? Don't tell me the women's liberation movement discovered the notion that you should treat people with
I know
dignity.
they're only
No,
re-emphasising
he's
it
not
in a particular
speaking
context.
on behalf of the Women's Liberation
No.
Movement. He's speaking on behalf of common
I know, but
sense.
she's being a little bit sneaky here because her context is that you got to throw everything over, that you got to women's liberation it requires
everything over is an
total
emotive
revolution
term. We have
within
to
a completely different
reorganize.
economic structure. It seems to be plain that that to the extent that women are prepared to rely on their own talents and on their own value, whether set by the marketplace or their attraction to other people, they are best off in a society that is as mobile as possible, which means the exact opposite of one of those socialist rigidities that
Well, that's your free
that you
trade,
fantasize.
It's Tom Paine all over again. It doesn't seem to work terribly well.
Well, it certainly hasn't hindered you. I
Don't
can't.
think, I mean, look, for God's sake, everyone's always saying, don't think it hasn't hindered you. I mean, I have no children. I have virtually no sex life. I have the kind of elite position that I have in this
Because
society
of your
at
talent.
enormous cost. But
Because of
I
your
paid
talent.
my dues
Well,
as well.
why shouldn't you pay your dues? You worked hard at
I'm
school.
not saying I shouldn't pay my dues. I'm pointing out to you that telling people that there's an escapee in your midst is not by way of telling them that the prison doesn't exist.
Yeah, exactly. And neither
Well, there's
Germaine
a-
nor I would say that we weren't in more privileged positions regarding choice and economic mobility and everything else than the male who was secondary modern educated.
Because one tadpole becomes a frog doesn't mean there are
I know, but the world abounds in socialist examples in which people would not necessarily have risen as Miss Middleweek and Miss Greer have in fact done in our mobile society, in which we are free to recognize their talent and reward them without putting them through any ideological litmus test. I'm sorry, the time's up.
Firing Line next week begins a special four-part series examining human behavior. For the first program, two prominent psychologists, B.F. Skinner of Harvard and Leon Festinger of the New School for Social Research, will debate how morals develop. Join them next week on Firing Line.
For a printed bound copy of this program, send 25 cents in coin to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250.